This week, I went with sort of a different take on some history. This is Cook County ICU by Corey Franklin, MD. And normally my histories are, full-blown history or biography. That's what I've been doing a lot of nowadays. But this came up in, oh God, my microphone. Leave it alone. This came up in the Audible Plus. I have that subscription. I have this unjustified fear of running out of books in my room, and then, of course, not having any content for the YouTube channel. So I'm sort of trying not to read what's in my room. But there's like 150 books in here, so it's silly. In any case, this is his, not a biography, right? This isn't his entire life. This is just sort of interesting things he remembers from being a doctor in Cook County, which is Chicago, big time city. So he's a doctor, right? He was a doctor his whole career. I'm not going to judge him as a writer, right? If that makes sense. It's not everything, obviously. I think this is the thing with, I would say, people who aren't writers, which is for history's sake, it's both good and bad, right? Let's say you're Robert A. Caros. He's a writer, right? So he can paint you the full picture of Texas or the Senate or whatever he's talking about, right? He paints a better picture for you. And it's a more thorough story. Whereas our doctor here, and even with people who aren't writers, maybe even readers, right? Maybe readers do a better job of this. It's a short book, right? But he was serving in ICUs and emergency rooms for like 30, 40 years or whatever the number is. There's more story than it's there. But he doesn't remember it all, right? I can kind of feel it. It scratches the surface, right? But it's still fun and it's still interesting. So I'm not gonna be too harsh on him, but that's something you'll notice if you read this book. I'm gonna give it a solid 3 out of 5. You don't need to stop what you're reading to read this. If you like history, this is enjoyable enough. You can grab it along the way of other things. If you liked sort of doctor TV shows, it feels a lot like those in a weird condensed way. So if you're into, Grey's Anatomy, at least the early seasons, not after the plane crash. It got a little wild. If you're into House, ER, these type of shows, right? This will be sort of, it'll have a good feel for you. Would I buy it, right? This is a good question because I don't own this one. Would I buy it? I don't know. It depends on the price, right? Maybe like $4 or $5 would be okay. I don't know if I would buy it because I don't think I would reread it, right? That's the main, I want rereadable things when I buy a book. So it'd be a good, maybe buy and pass along kind of book. All right. What happened? He started off way back in the day, somewhere in the 70s, right? So it was sort of the time frame. You go through medical school and you end up at a place. So you're the lowest rung on the ladder. And there's a lot of hazing, he says, right? And hazing and intimidating. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. This sort of overlord mentality, which, on the surface, I would think maybe that's not right. Why should these people have this overlord mentality? But then you think about it and, Any mistake the student makes, somebody could die, right? So we don't have a lot of wiggle room comparatively. He tells the story of a friend or a colleague, right? So he's on the lowest rung. He has to hold these clamps, where you're holding the liver out of the way of the gallbladder, right? Which is another fun part about this. It's almost in passing. Oh God, I'm going to destroy my microphone. It's almost in passing because he's a doctor, he can go in and out of this really cool medical jargon and medical issues, and you have fun little tidbits you pick up along the way that you can put more weight on than you would sort of someone who's not in the medical field or less important subject matter. So he has to hold this gallbladder back, and it just takes a long time, and your arms get tired. And then, of course, he had the unmitigated gall to say, how we going? Because his arms are getting tired. And, the doctor's just berating him, saying, I could get a monkey to do what you do. You're not, there's no we in this. You're just a hired hand. You should shut up. This kind of attitude. I mean, like I said, I don't think, not just the 70s, but I don't think that's entirely wrong. But I don't know. I mean, this is how the medical field's been working, apparently. He has the various chapter names like medicines can make you sick, or, radiation and chocolate. These fun, catchy titles to the chapters, which again feel like episodes of a TV show. It has a good fun feel. But there's this undercurrent, right? Because we aren't in the medical field, so we don't sort of see behind the curtain. So when somebody can show you a peek of what's happening, I find it highly interesting information just to go get, right? So he'll say medications can make you sick, and it's odd to hear from a doctor. But then he goes on to describe, there's an old guy who's smart, right? So, but he has maybe Alzheimer's or something like this. They give him some medication and he starts to go bad. Hallucinations, things like this. It turned out it was the medication. Now, he sort of was aware of it, but he's low on the rung. So even if he says something, there's no guarantee the other doctor's going to do anything about it. And he watched as a guy who, right, like, so they're like, can you name me the president? And he starts naming the vice presidents from the date back to the Civil War, right? So the guy's there, and he's a bit of a smart aleck. But he goes from that to pure hallucinations. And it was the medication that he found. He found out for sure later. But I'm thinking of, like, what if that's me or someone I know, right? Where you're in the hospital, you think you trust the doctors. The young one might know something that helps your cause, but won't say anything because the older ones will shut them down. And the older ones, what? Just practicing on you? They might not know, they might not care enough what the medication's doing, or maybe the medication messes you up a little before it fixes you, right? But it didn't fix this guy. This guy ended up dying. They sent him to a psych ward, and he just deteriorated. Well, mind you, he was old already, but, that's an issue you could come up with in the hospital. It's not pleasant to think about, but, it's sitting there, right? He had another one where he knew of a technique to warm, because it's Chicago, right? And occasionally, well, I say occasionally, every year, they have hypothermic patients. It's so cold that they come in hypothermic, and you need to warm them up. There's all kind of techniques that come up. He knew of one that could help, right? And he's trying to help this lady, and he knows the technique that could help, but he's not authorized to use it, and the higher-ups won't authorize the use of the technique. And then she dies, right? On the one hand, you want doctors to be able to make a move, right, to help your cause. On the other hand, you can't have hotshots running around trying stuff on people, right? Especially not you, not if you're hypothermic. You want what works best. So it's this weird catch-22 that you have in there. And then, I don't know what I think about it, right? Like, on the one hand, those doctors, we can't guarantee she'd live either way. But the doctors didn't use a technique that ended up being common practice. And then from his perspective, now I wonder if this is part of it, right? Because at some point he ages into being the one in charge. And he says a lot of times where these things happened and he remembered them. And then he would treat the underlings, his medical students, his young residents, he'd treat them different, remembering what it was like when he was a resident. Now, I'd hope that's the norm. I'd hope maybe that's why the system works, is because you get a frustration and then you try and not re-implement those frustrations. So, each generation gets a little better. But I'm not exactly sure. What if I hazed people, so it's my turn. I was hazed, so it's my turn to do the hazing, and you don't learn the lesson? I don't know. But again, from the inside, that's his perspective, you get this sense of everything's not so pristine in a hospital, right? And that there could be more, what do we say? What does he say? Misadventures than we'd care to think about. He started before, I don't know if he started before or not. I think he did. Yeah, the 70s. He said before emergency room wasn't its own medical speciality, which is weird. I'll see old shows, I think old emergency episodes, because there was a time when paramedic wasn't a thing, right? They'd send a fireman and they'd do the initial whatever. And then an ambulance would come, and it's just sort of strong dudes who just, chuck you on a stretcher, yeet you in the bag, and get you to the hospital as soon as possible. And for a while there, you can see it in this show, which is, sort of, the point of the show isn't to teach you this, but it inadvertently shows you. They have like a radio system, and the doctor sits by the radio and is talking to the fireman about a medical issue. It really was this weird precursor to paramedics, where instead of wasting a doctor's time, we train someone up to do these sort of things. Well, it was the same with ERs, right? Where we would just have a doctor go down there and deal with stuff, but an emergency room deals with different things, right? It's 2 a.m. Rando comes in. It could be a crazy person. Happens consistently. Could be a homeless person. Happens consistently. Could just look homeless and is actually this other medical issue. Right? So he said, right, it became its own medical field. And then like the show ER comes out. And then it goes from its own medical thing to one of the most popular for young medical students to get into, because they grew up watching the show. They want to get involved. So it's pretty cool that even TV movies has an effect in the medical field. He says, and I've heard this before in the policing profession as well. I'm not a policeman. I know people who've been around it, right? And he says every nurse in every ER he's ever worked with has the full moon theory, where they have this belief that there's more issues on a full moon. And that he goes, there's no science that says this whatsoever, but you can't dissuade the nurses of this belief, right? And it's weird that it's so pervasive in the sort of emergency first responder field. Paramedics, nurses, police, firemen, I'm sure they all have this sort of same theory in their mind. It's kind of funny. But he says there's no science to it. But I'm like, I don't know if I believe that. He has a chapter called Dead Men Tell Dead men don't tell tales, but sometimes get x-rays and ECGs. He said what happened is, and it's a bit of gallows humor here. Gallows humor being, again, if you're like a policeman or fireman or paramedic or emergency room doctor or doctor in general, probably soldiers as well. Anywhere where sort of horrific stuff can happen sort of consistently. So if us normies see like a body horribly mangled, that's traumatic for us. But a paramedic's going to see how many bodies mangled night in and night out, right? And they package them up, they send them to the doctor, and the doctor sees more mangled body, fixes them, and then these people somehow live or sometimes die, right? You get used to it in a kind of way. Same as in every field, there are certain things that happen, and you laugh about no pins, or they, in the meat market, they're laughing at how big a chicken is, or whatever the case is, right? Every sort of group has their thing, right? These sort of inside jokes. That's gallows humor. And it's sort of in the sense that it's too much, right? Seeing this horrificness is kind of too much for people. And that if you don't have any kind of break, no kind of humor to relieve the pressure, it overload. So they'll make little jokes. And from the outside, it's horrific. But from the inside, it's not malicious. So he sets that up to sort of say this story. He says back in those days, it might happen now in a different degree. Here's patient A, and he's scheduled for various x-rays the next day, various scans. But in the middle of the night, he's died for whatever reason, right? So he'll come and he'll pronounce the person dead, but then the morgue's not open yet, the body can't be moved, whatever the reason, right? So he says, this happened one time, and the technician comes in not knowing that senior patient has died. And he runs his heart scan on the guy, right? And the heart scan comes up flatlined. I'm like, yeah, because he's dead. But he's a technician, so he runs it and then leaves the scan and then moves on because he's got to scan other people. He didn't feel the body. No one knew it was cold. And so he's sitting there with some medical students, and they're going to sort of troll a resident. And so he calls the resident over, and he's like, Ted, look at this. What do you make of this scan? I think this guy's having this heart complication. The resident looks at the scan. Of course, the point he's making is the resident didn't look at the patient. That's what he's trying to teach that guy. He looks at the scan and he calls the guy over, and the guy's like, no, my machine's working just fine. And he starts running all these, he's about to call to run more tests on the guy. Right? And then the students start laughing. He was gonna x-ray the guy. And then he's like, maybe you should check his pulse. And he checks the pulse, and of course the body's cold because the dude's been dead. And then he gets the joke, right? And everyone starts to laugh at him a little bit. I'm like, that's just hilarious. Now, you are playing with it. You are playing with a dead body. But a resident maybe learned a lesson, like check the patient, right? Which he says ends up happening a lot. He has a whole chapter on it with diagnostics, right? So what does he call it? He calls it diagnostic anchoring and inertia, where the first person says it's such and such, it's lupus. And then everyone jumps on board that, right? So it's more important to try and figure out how it's lupus than to figure out what's happening. That what ends up written on that paper can really affect downstream for this patient. Because some people misread cultural differences, or some people just read and don't look at the patient or get confused, right? These sort of things can steamroll onto themselves. And he says that as a medical field, they have to look out for that. Which again is another thing normies can take and keep in mind when they go into a hospital. It's unpleasant to think about, but you have to think about it. Errors can be made. And if it's you or if it's your person, you kind of got to be the eyes and not be afraid to point out something you think might be an error. Just to, what do we say? The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Make a little noise. It's not going to kill anybody, but it could save your person, because there are a myriad of issues that could come up, that could snag, and your person could get caught in that snag. Not good. He talks about alcohol withdrawals, DTs. There are stages to this, which, I sort of didn't know, not being an alcoholic myself, where sort of at a lower grade, the cure to these withdrawals is obviously more alcohol. So I'm just imagining you're in the hospital and it's 1980 and you're prescribing booze to people. That's just kind of funny to me that booze is the medicine, right? In any case, there are more severe cases. You can get hallucinations. I didn't know, like vivid. He had multiple people over the years think that they had dinner with him at, what does he say, a Greasy Spoon or a fancy club nearby, right? And they were sure. The memory was in their head. They were for sure. And he's like, I've never met you, and I've never been to that eating establishment. He said one time he had two of these patients sort of across the room from each other. And one started hallucinating that he was in a car wreck on the I-95 or whatever road's down there. And then the other one, like, joined in the hallucination, like he was the one who got hit. So much so that they had a full-on, like, what the F you mean? I hit your car. I didn't hit your car. I'll F you up for lying about me. The full-on, fender-bender, heated argument. And they were just listening, right? The nurses and everyone was just listening to this back and forth of a shared hallucination that just sort of concocted itself out of the blue. And then later they left friends and who knows what else. One of the coolest ones to me, he says it's Mr. Rodriguez's secret, right? So an old guy comes in and he's helping veterans. An old guy comes in and he looks really old. And they're like, he could be World War II, but he looks even older than that. So they ask him, they're like, you didn't serve in World War II, did you? And he's like, no. He says, I served in the Spanish-American War. And I'm personally, again, I like history, I'm flipping out. I'm like, that's got to be cool. Well, everyone there was flipping out too. And because he made it like a huge announcement. He's like, ladies and gentlemen, we have history in our midst. Because anyone who's been alive through, I don't know, he's like 100-something years old by the time he was sitting in this hospital bed getting this help. And I'm like, it's just too cool. How could you not just talk to a guy who lived through that? But he says the guy got nervous, right? He says, Doc, come here. He says, I was on the Spanish side. Right? Because he's nervous and then the doctor doesn't say anything because the patient doesn't want him to. But he's nervous thinking, I'm getting free medical, but I don't know if the free medical applies if I'm not an American veteran of a war, right? And I just thought it was funny because there's no way in whatever year that happened in, 70s, 80s, even the 90s, there's no way if someone was alive through the Spanish-American War that the Veterans Association or whatever would kick him to the curb because he wasn't an American veteran. It just wouldn't happen, right? Even now, we have former Japanese guys, right? meeting our veterans at Pearl Harbor, and they're like, yeah, I blew that ship up. And the other guy's like, yeah, my friend was on that ship. And they don't hate each other, right? There's no, at a certain point, when the dude's like 80 or 90, you almost just lose the animosity. And you're just stuck with sort of living history. And that sort of seems to supersede everything. So I'm like, if you'd have told back then that here's someone who served Spain in the Spanish-American War, I'm like, I can almost guarantee the mayor would have shown up, the ambassador of Spain would have shown up. We might have had the president and the president of Spain show up, shake hands over your sick bed, right? You know, politicians love that crap. Like, we're here helping a veteran of our ally, Spain. And then Spain would come over and like, we appreciate America, our ally, helping our veterans, even from long ago, right? You know, politicians love this mess. There's no way this guy ends up on the street. There's just no way. He brings up moral issues. Now, I don't know how you'd feel. Well, I don't know how doctors feel, because I guess it's their issue. But what do you do when someone egregious comes up, right? Sort of, I didn't miss anything. So like the Boston bomber, what do you do? Because they're like, he didn't, but he was talking about those people, where they live in Boston, they were terrorized by these people, but here he is in your hospital floor, and you got to treat him. Could you treat him? Would you? These kind of questions come up. And he said for some of those nurses, they said, I treated him when he was hurt, but I hope he gets the death penalty. And it's just this weird, it seems at odds with itself, but that's just sort of what they have to maneuver through sometimes when they're in the medical field. It's kind of trippy. He said he was the first doctor to see John Wayne Gacy. He said at one point he had to do medical for a Richard Speck. These are serial killers, right? These are horrible. And he said the thing that he remembers about them is that they would like stare at him menacingly. He said it reminded him of Hannibal. Can you imagine? I just think it's so cool. Not that these people kill people, but serial killers are a big subject, especially in your crime genre. So to have a guy who met two of them is super cool. He gave one story, and now he says it's a story because he didn't have any proof. But to me, it's cool that the story was they had a janitor, an old janitor, and that he died in the morgue. And then when they found out that he had been a cannibal and was munching on the people in the morgue. Now, he says it's not true, or that he can't confirm that it's true or not. But one, to me, it sounds plausible. Two, it's just an interesting story. But three, and more interesting than all of it, is, again, there's a bubble to each sort of group. If you're in the automotive field, if you're a doctor, a policeman, whatever the thing is, right? There are little bubbles, and in the time you spend in those bubbles, there are interactions. And other people coming into those bubbles make those interactions not happen, right? Because you're not part of the group, we won't bring up such and such. And I feel like this is a story that they wouldn't normally retell. They being nurses, doctors, people who work in hospitals, right? They're big entities. And I feel like when I read this bit, that I am in the group, so to speak. I'm in the bubble. I get a feel. I just almost get a feel for how they interact in that group. It's very cool. That's why I'm saying, that's why this little history was fun. It's these nuggets of information that help when you do, or when you add to other histories, right? that you have this deeper perspective, even if that wasn't his intention. It's something you can take from it. So, in the one sense, it's not as detailed or as informative as it could be, but it has details that other histories don't. And when you read history, it all stitches together in your head in a very fun way, a very cool way. So for that, I will remember this book. He said dude worked on The Fugitive. Dude met Harrison Ford. He was the one a lot of the inspiration came from for that character. Was on set, the whole thing, the whole 9 yards. He talked a lot, that scene where Harrison Ford is talking to the kid and then, checks the x-ray. He talked Harrison Ford through a lot of what he would do on that scene. And he said Harrison Ford did it to a T. But again, you got a guy who met John Wayne Gacy, Princess Diana, and Harrison Ford, all intermixed with various crazy people, funny people. It's kind of crazy. And I know, again, it's a short book. I can feel there's more story here. He just doesn't recall it at the time of sitting and writing. He said he treated one of the first AIDS patients. Now, again, back in the day being the 80s, 90s, something to this effect. AIDS hadn't blown up yet, right? There's a whole story to, the trail, being on the trail of AIDS and sort of catching up to it. It was messing people. What it would do is lowering your immune system, right? So then you would get some horrifying and rare disease. And then that disease kills you, right? So the doctor's looking at that disease, not registering that it's this other disease that's making you susceptible to these diseases, right? So in that sense, it was able to spread through the gay community. This is just the truth of it. I know there was a big to-do about not calling it a gay disease. They didn't want retaliations and this kind of thing. In any case, it did spread through a lot of gay people in the 80s. They didn't register at the time that it was going through the gay community. And then they didn't register that these sort of anomalous things were all connected. And so he remembers because at that time he said they didn't wear gloves all the time. You would just go in, handle your business, and then wash your hands, before and after, obviously. But he says he remembers being sort of, elbow deep in some blood of an AIDS person. And then he was sort of now thankful and sort of in wonderment about how he didn't get AIDS. How him and none of his other, co-workers didn't end up with AIDS. Of course they use gloves and stuff now. But it's kind of crazy because, again, he says they didn't print papers on that because they didn't think it was a thing. And then later he connects the pieces that this must have been one of the earliest AIDS patients coming right into Cook County. It was a huge deal in the medical field. Fauci was involved. Fauci was involved in the AIDS epidemic as well as the COVID epidemic. For good or bad, I'll let history decide, right? Look into it. Look into it if you want to have some fun. He brought up another issue, 2 more issues I like that he brought up. And one was politics. Politics, speaking of Fauci, politics and medicine. He said it was the 70s or the 80s. I'm not exactly sure what. And a patient comes in and he goes, apart from the government, medicine is the greatest threat to civil liberties that Americans or anyone can face. He says, a doctor can restrain you. A doctor can declare you incompetent, can declare you crazy, can lock you up in a room because you're crazy. There's a lot of things a doctor can actually do that doesn't happen anywhere. I'm like, police have to arrest you. They can hold you for a bit, but there's rules. And some of the rules get stripped away with medicine, right? So they walk with this responsibility. And he says at one point, one of these, I think alcoholic, comes in and he goes, I think we should restrain this person, because if the hallucination gets bad enough, they could be a danger to themselves or anyone else of us. But he was like, the higher ups didn't. The higher ups were strong believers in civil liberties. And so they thought this was a misstep. I don't want to tie this man down. Now, he didn't say it, but I'm gonna assume, because the civil rights movement, he was alive through a lot of that. I'm gonna assume it might have been a black guy or black doctors, something to this effect. It could be white doctors not wanting to tie up a black guy. In any case, it's just an assumption I'm making. He didn't say one way or the other, because it doesn't affect the point, but it kind of illustrates the point to me. In any case, they didn't want to tie him down. They didn't like the idea. Now I'm like, that's politics, right? That's your personal politics in interfering with the patient. I mean, that is what it is. And it's not pleasant to think about. We saw it a lot in the COVID scare, where doctors wanted to not let you, there were some people saying, medical people, you shouldn't be allowed in a hospital unless you get your COVID vax, this kind of issue. Where as opposed to just, do no harm and treat everyone you can treat. It's not good. It's never good. I think right now, well, at the time of this filming, they're having a major issue with doctors in Korea, where they're like boycotting because they don't want more doctors allowed in. The government wants to up the number of students, and they're like, we don't want that. I'm assuming it's, supply and demand. If there are more doctors, I might get paid less, which again, it's a real thing for them. But on the other hand, you now have patients suffering for greed, for money, for this person's job. It doesn't taste good, right? It doesn't taste good to think about. But it's sitting there and it's staring at us, and we got to sort of think about it sometimes. And here in this case, the guy needed to be restrained, and because he wasn't, he ran to a fire escape, and they only luckily were able to talk him down. He escaped again because they still didn't want to tie him up. And again, he could have jumped. He said because he was the one on call, the fire chief gave him the riot act, so to speak. He's like, if I have to come back here, we're going to have a problem. And he just ate it because, that's what there's no point in arguing. There's no point in trying to tell him, it's my higher ups didn't let me such and such. He's not in the mood to hear it. So then he goes to his higher ups and he's like, I was physically bigger than them. And he goes, this is the only time I ever threatened anyone with any kind of violence. But he's like, we're tying this guy up. I don't want to hear another word about this, or we're going to have a problem. Right? And they ended up restraining him. But politics and medicine, it's not good. And then he ends with that. The biggest surprise to me in this book was he had an issue with HIPAA. HIPAA is the legal law that makes it so that, they don't spill all your medical information. In my mind, this had always been. But in reality, it wasn't a law. In reality, it was an oath the doctors took, right? Just a natural course of their practice. And so sometimes doctors would let this or that slip. But in his opinion, on the whole, they kept a pretty good lid on it. But he goes, HIPAA was the first time you were going to allow the government between the doctor and the patient. There's this interference from the outside. And he's not sure that it's been that good. And he says, to him, it leads to bad, right? It's led down this route that's not good. He says he's seen clergy not allowed to find a room number of one of their flock. He's had trouble with, I think personally and with other doctors, of getting clinical information, right? So give me this sort of medical history about this person. And because there's this big bureaucracy behind the scenes saying, no, you can't have that, I need this and that clearance, that there's this time lag between other doctors sharing information about a person for a medical reason. And you're like, well, I kind of understand that. And he goes, you know who doesn't have that lag? Government and insurance. And so I'm like, so my insurance can get my medical information faster than the doctor treating me. That can't be good. It's got to be bad. And it leads them to sort of the idea of most of them. The idea of most people becoming doctors is to help people. And it has been since, way back in the day. The medical profession is one of the oldest in existence. And that they've had this sort of do no harm, virtue first mantra about themselves. And for all the other faults, that had been the driving force, right? Well, then you add HIPAA, now you add all these regulations, and then you add sort of big pharma and the big business of hospitals. And he sees a change because he started, again, 40 years, you'll see a change in your field. He says now you have, a lot of free clinics were closing or getting absorbed, where this is historically, people are religious, Catholic, Protestant, this kind of thing. That religion says you help the downtrodden, and so people would donate charity money to these religious hospitals. And then the religious hospital would just help as many people as they could. And he's like, he saw where the money side, not of these hospitals, but of the industry, didn't like this large section of them not making profit, so to speak, right? So if there were less charity hospitals, then all those charities would become paying customers, and my hospital would get bigger, right? The money side versus sort of what he calls the virtue side. And then he will see a lot now where he goes, back in the day, doctors used to make house calls, and that's out. Everyone's conglomerating, so to speak, and that he wishes it would be more like it used to be, less of the business side. And I'm a little conflicted, right? Because on the one hand, there aren't enough doctors. There never have been. It's more people than doctors. So, yes, you make house calls. But how many people have never called because there's no way the doctor's going to come all the way out, or he is tired, he's a human being. You can only help so many at a small scale, right? Where mass production, like in food and clothing, it's made clothes cheaper. It's made food cheaper. So less people starve, less people have, and when you worry less about the basics, you can worry about higher level things, et cetera, et cetera. So these things have their faults, but, like WebMD, where I can get on my iPad and talk to a doctor, and he doesn't have to travel 80 miles this way and 100 miles that way and 70, he can see 15 people and cover minor, that's a sore throat, that's strep, you need this, that's pink eye, do this. If it gets worse, go to this doctor. He can see a lot of people and ease a lot of suffering from his home. That's technology. That's big. That's the business of medicine. But on the other hand, right, you see these holes where they don't want to move in a certain way, or they don't want to risk the business, or they may be overly callous to certain people, right? So I don't know. I'm conflicted about it. He certainly didn't like it. He certainly liked the old way. And I was a little surprised at hearing a doctor not like HIPAA. And I wonder if it was better the old way, right? On HIPAA. but I'm not exactly. I don't like, even if you keep HIPAA, I don't like that it's a lag between my doctor and my information, and not a lag between my insurance and my information, right? There should be a lag. Let's let it be in the insurance and in the government, especially. But he sort of ends the book on that, right? He's trying to give this perspective and tell you, get your mind going on these issues. And it sort of does. You have a lot of these thoughts about the medical field that you didn't have going in. So on the one hand, it's not, like I said, it's not the most in-depth history, but it is very, very interesting. And I don't know, you might be young, you might be older. At some point, you might have some interactions with these hospitals. And it wouldn't hurt to have this information in your head going in. Again, it's nothing super hyper specific, but it gives you a feel, right? A sort of an understanding behind the curtain that could help your cause, right? In a way. So that was Cook County ICU. And now we're doing our ads. These are my books. You can buy them if you want to help the channel. They don't help you in any actual way. I mean, this is no medical information here. It's just a book. You just read it and have fun. All right, people. I will talk to you, lovely lot, next week.